evening, everyone. I'm Maria DeRosa, Dean of the Faculty of Science at Carleton University. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Let's all take a moment to reflect and be grateful for this opportunity to live, learn, work on this land. As we're about to embark on a really interesting interdisciplinary discussion, let's think about how some of this approach can help us towards reconciliation. So I would like to officially welcome everyone to this special edition of our Science Café series, hosted in collaboration with our good friends at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. In 2008, our Science Café series was born as a bridge between Carleton University researchers and the wider Ottawa community. What started as intimate gatherings at a Glebe coffee shop evolved into engaging sessions at the Sunnyside Library, on Zoom during the pandemic, and at other venues like this amazing venue, the Carleton Dominion-Chalmers Centre. Our Science Café series, among other initiatives, is a testament to Carleton's dedication to fostering the vital connection to our local community and to enhancing the appreciation of science and research in society. We're really proud to offer these events to the public free of charge, and we look forward to continuing this journey of knowledge sharing together. Hope you'll join us at future Science Cafés. We're really thrilled to have everyone here at Carleton Dominion-Chalmers Centre for what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. What makes this event truly unique from our perspective is the fusion of scientific inquiry and social perspectives as we explore the intricate relationship between cannabis use and mental health. We're really excited here to have award-winning experts from our Carleton community uniting the realms of sciences and social sciences to delve deep into this important topic. Our commitment to cross-faculty collaboration and interdisciplinary endeavors is at the heart of this event. We believe that it is through the synergy of diverse disciplines we can address complex social challenges and make a real-world impact. Our researchers, students, and society as a whole stand to benefit immensely from this approach. Throughout the evening, we encourage you to share your thoughts and insights on social media. Use the hashtag Carleton Science and tag @CarletonScience in your posts. Your engagement adds richness to our discussion and will contribute to the wider dissemination of this important knowledge. But before we dive into this fascinating conversation, I want to introduce someone who has been instrumental in making this collaboration possible. Please join me in welcoming Anne Bowker, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, who's played a pivotal role in bringing together the worlds of science and social science today together for this important event. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks, Maria. And I guess, you get to go first, so I get the applause. That's, a neat kind of... So thanks for the introduction and for the warm welcome to all of you who have joined us this evening at Carleton Dominion-Chalmers Centre. We anticipate, as Maria said, a really extraordinary night ahead. It's not a regular occurrence, believe it or not, to witness the collaborative efforts of our two faculties, the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, in a live public event like this. However, it is a common thread in our academic community that our faculty members frequently come together, combining our complementary yet distinct expertise and perspectives to address pressing public concerns. So tonight's discussion, as Maria mentioned, on the intricate relationship between cannabis use and mental health exemplifies this collaborative spirit. I'm in complete agreement with Maria that one of our most significant strengths at Carleton lies in our readiness to approach complex issues through a truly multidisciplinary lens. To me, this is where we cultivate real world-changing insights. Our distinguished panel tonight will undoubtedly exemplify the power of this dynamic multidisciplinary teamwork. As cannabis assumes a more prominent role in Canadian society, just heard something on CBC like literally half an hour ago, I don't know if any of you were driving, but talking about cannabis as well, it becomes increasingly essential, I think, that we grapple with its implications and impact, particularly on our individual and collective mental well-being. I'm very excited to gain insights from the brilliant minds of Drs. Patterson, Howard, Hellemans, and Davies, and I hope you are too. Before I pass this over to our moderator, Dr. Jim Davies, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all those in the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences who have worked to organize this great event. Also a special thanks to Mara Brown and the exceptional team here at CDCC, and most importantly, I extend my gratitude to each one of you for joining us here tonight. So without further ado, turn it over to Jim.
Good evening. I'm Jim Davies, professor of cognitive science at Carleton, and I'm going to be moderating tonight and asking questions of these eminent scholars we have here. I'm going to read their impressive biographies right now. First, we have Dr. Zachary Patterson.
Woo!
And he got his PhD from an obscure university called Carleton Neuroscience, 2014. And he worked at the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction as a research and policy analyst and knowledge broker. And then in 2018, he returned to Carleton to work as an instructor for the Department of Neuroscience. And his interests include the effects of drugs, and particularly cannabis and opioids, on the brain and how these drugs impact both human behavior and society. I'm trying to speak a little slowly because I recognize there's a big echo in this room. I want to do the same. Next, we have Dr. Andrea Howard on the end there. An associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Carleton. She's director of the Pickering Center for Research in Human Development. She got her PhD at the University of Alberta in developmental psychology in 2010, and now she studies well-being and health-related behaviors, including mental health, alcohol and drug use, in adolescence and in the transition to adulthood, with some studies emphasizing special challenges facing university students and young people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Dr. Howard has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers, and her research has been funded by national granting agencies in Canada and in the US. Outside of her core program of research, Dr. Howard is active in scholarly communities promoting open science practices in developmental and clinical psychology. Finally, we have Dr. Kim Hellemans. Dr. Hellemans is an assistant professor in neuroscience and is the associate dean of science at Carleton University. She has received several prestigious teaching awards that recognize her passion and dedication to university teaching, including the Provost Fellowship in Teaching Award and most recently the Okufa Provincial Teaching Award. I sat in on one of her classes and I can vouch that she is excellent. Her current research is focused on student mental health with a focus on how life stressors, cannabis use, and social media among university students relate to mental health and academic outcomes. She's passionate about knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization and has created several freely available animations on the topic of neuroscience, addiction, and stigma. She is co-host of the award-winning podcast, Minding the Brain. That sounds good. I might check it out. And I just want to say, the introductions by Anne and Maria said this was a collaboration between the Faculty of Arts and Social Science and the Faculty of Science, but I do note, looking over these biographies, that not only are they a mix of people from those faculties, but each one of them is involved with science and broader issues as well. So each one of these individuals is interdisciplinary. So let's get into some questions. Let's start with some neuroscience. Kim, would you like to tell us how cannabis does what it does in the brain? How does it work?
So we're going to start with the hard ones. Thank you. So let's start talking about cannabis and how cannabis works in the brain. I was teaching my class earlier today, and when dropping words like endocannabinoid system, and the students were like, what? What is that? I said, just wait, we'll learn today. So cannabis is a plant. Most substances that have an addictive potential, so things like cocaine, opioids like morphine or heroin, alcohol, have their origins in plants. And what humanity has done is we've taken these plants and we've refined them and we've ground them up and we've added chemicals to them and we've purified them and extracted them and made them into soluble form so that we can inject them or inhale them or ingest them, as it were. And the reason why these substances, these plants, have impact on us as humans is because they contain specific substances that act on our brain chemistry. And so that's how most substances work in the brain, is they mimic existing proteins that function in the brain. So things like neurotransmitters, which are the main signaling molecule in the human brain, act on key receptors like a lock and a key. And so exogenous substances, drugs, addictive substances, work by virtue of the fact that they mimic that key in the lock. And so cannabis is pretty unique in that it is the only other substance that's like that is the opioids. But cannabis is unique in that it mimics an endogenous system in the brain, which is called the endo, meaning within, cannabinoid system. And of course, humans have been using cannabis for much, much longer than we've known about the endocannabinoid system, which was really in the 20th century we started to understand more about how cannabis works in the brain. So the endocannabinoid system is a series of signals in the brain it's responsible for governing our response to stress. And so when an organism is experiencing things like stress and pain or fear even, the endocannabinoid system is active. And what happens is that when the endocannabinoid system is active, is it produces or synthesizes and releases these endocannabinoids, which are endogenous molecules inside the brain. And things like anandamide or AEA is the key signaling molecule, and 2-AG, 2-arachidonoglycerol. So those are the two main signaling molecules, the endocannabinoids, and they bind to receptors. And those receptors are cleverly known as CB1 receptors, cannabinoid receptor type 1, which is the most commonly found receptor in the human brain. And then we have a CB type 2, which is found outside of the central nervous system, mostly on immune cells. So anandamide is released when we're experiencing times of stress or fear. Anandamide is released, it binds to CB1, and we have this sort of calming down of the nervous system. Cannabis, its main compounds, it consists of a whole bunch of phytocannabinoids, phyto meaning plant, hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands that we don't know of yet. The main ingredient in cannabis plants is known as delta-9 THC hydroxycannabinol, or THC for short. And THC mimics anandamide. So it binds to those CB1 receptors. But the big difference is when we're using cannabis products, and particularly if we smoke them, because when we smoke them, the inhalation means that it gets very rapidly absorbed in our bloodstream, gets right up into our brain, and we feel high very quickly, versus if we take an edible, it has to go through our guts, pass through the liver, and so on. It takes quite a bit longer to get up into our brain. So when we use these products, what's happening is THC is entering our bloodstream and traveling into the brain and binding to those CB1 receptors, and we have massive action of that endocannabinoid system. So when we are under the influence of cannabis products, we feel relaxed, we feel calm, we feel giddy, because the other thing that happens is it activates our reward circuits in the brain. But importantly, the endocannabinoid system, everyone's like, well, why don't I feel high when the endocannabinoid system is active? And that's because cannabis products and THC activate that system at a much higher quantity and potency than the natural endocannabinoids, which actually degrade very quickly in the human brain. They have action, they very quickly are cut up by their chemicals, the enzymes, so that it's actually metabolized very rapidly, whereas cannabis products kind of stay and percolate in our brain for much longer. So the bottom line is, the reason that how cannabis works and how it makes us feel calm and relaxed and high is because it acts on that endocannabinoid system in the human brain that is there in place, so that when our organisms experience stress or trauma or painful events, we have a system in the brain that helps us cope with that and calm down the nervous system once we experience those stressors. So there you go.
If the endocannabinoid system functions to reduce stress, that sounds like it corresponds well with some of the reasons people take cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. For the stress reduction.
Absolutely, yep. And we do see in some of our surveys, when we look at students' use of cannabis products, for example, we ask them, what's your main reason for using cannabis? And there are several students that say to reduce stress.
So but the euphoria and the high, is that just something that the endocannabinoid system, in its natural condition, it never gets that intense?
No, it never would really. And it's probably because what the other system that THC works on is that reward circuit. And because of the complex nature of the pharmacodynamics in the brain around the reward circuit, is that cannabis products activate that reward circuit at a very, very high potency or level than the endocannabinoid system ever would.
It's also interesting that cannabis seems to reduce cognitive function sometimes. Is that also? Do we have a neuroscience explanation for
well,
that too?
so, I mean, part of that, when you think about it evolutionarily, is we don't necessarily want to remember all the bad things that happen to us, right? Sometimes it's advantageous. We want to remember, like, to avoid certain situations, but it's actually advantageous to kind of like have that memory be suppressed to some extent. So the endocannabinoid system is responsible to that to varying degrees, and we're going to talk a little bit later potentially about PTSD, but that's why cannabis products have been used therapeutically as a potential treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Great. Okay. So since this is about cannabis and university and education, what do students think about cannabis? There must have been some research done on student attitudes and this kind of thing. Do they have generally positive associations with cannabis, or do they fear it like a say no to drugs kind of way, and they group it into that category? What can we say about that?
It's a great question, and it's I think an answer that evolves over time. So I think it's very important that we continue to monitor what university students, what youth across this country think about cannabis. When I was at my last job at CCSA, myself and a few dear colleagues ran a pretty amazing study where we actually, and I shouldn't say we, because my colleagues Anna and Katie were the ones that traveled to every single province and territory across the country and actually spoke with youth, with young adults, with university students to try to get a better idea of their perception of cannabis. And the results from that study were pretty interesting. I think you heard a lot of the common things that you would expect to hear, but there were certainly some themes that are worth, I think, highlighting here. One of them, one of the most consistent themes were that young adults viewed cannabis as less harmful than pretty much any of the other drugs. And so some of them would say it's less harmful than alcohol or the opioids or, cocaine and the amphetamines. And that perception of kind of low risk was also cited as one of the main reasons why young adults might choose to consume cannabis. So there was sort of this relationship between perception of harm and frequency of use. The more and more you think cannabis is safe or not harmful, the more and more likely you are to use cannabis. So that was definitely one of the themes. Another theme was there was a lot of confusion between messaging. So when we spoke to young adults across the country, they're all saying they're getting their information from the internet. It's like, well, if you've been on the internet any time recently, it's kind of the wild, wild west as far as information, and you can kind of find any information you're looking for to support like a pre-existing opinion. So I did think that was a little bit problematic. And so they're going to the internet to find their information, and of course there's some good information, there's probably some not so good information. So there's a lot of confusion about what specifically the risks of harm or the potential benefits of cannabis were. Another theme that I always chuckle, and this is a story that I always tell my students, is there was this perception that cannabis made you a better driver. And this was consistent, and I'm telling you, we went to, I don't think we hit every single province and territory, but the vast majority of PTs, as we call them, the youth were saying the same thing. They're saying, like, cannabis makes me a better driver, and we would probe that a little bit and say, what do you mean it makes you a better driver? All the data in the world suggests that it makes you a worse driver, and they would say, well, I might be a little bit more paranoid, so I'm less likely to speed. There was actually one story that still I remember to this day, and this young man was saying, well, look, I never break more than one law at a time, and so so if I'm consuming cannabis, I'll be wearing my seatbelt. I'm not going to be driving over the speed limit, and so and therefore that makes them a better driver. And so that was a theme that was very alarming, concerning, because like I said, all of the evidence in the world would point to the fact that cannabis reduces reaction time, and you mentioned cognition, so it interferes with decision making a little bit, and so all of these mean that it probably isn't making you a better driver. So those are some of the major themes, and then I guess I'll close with, not all young adults would recognize that cannabis does have harmful effects or could be addictive. And I know we'll probably get into talking about the addictive properties of cannabis, so I'll save it for a little bit later. But there is a giant misconception on the addictive properties or addictive potential of cannabis. So that's kind of the key findings from that report. But I want to sort of loop back to where I started. Like, I do think our youth and young adults in this country, their views on cannabis will change over time. And so I do think it's really important it's a really great question. I think it's a question that we keep revisiting over the years so that we can better, stage our messaging or our prevention efforts or our education, and that can reflect what the youth are actually thinking about cannabis.
Yeah. I'm heartened by the laughter from the audience when you suggested that it was good for driving. It means not many people in the audience believe that. So, well, let's talk about if cannabis is bad for you. Is there some amount of cannabis that isn't harmful, or is it that any amount is bad for you? Andrea, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, I think of this as a bigger question that has to do with how we study effects of substances in general on well-being or any kinds of outcomes at all, whether it's driving performance or mental health. Most studies will use some kind of self-report, right? So we ask people, how often do you use cannabis in the past year, in the past 30 days? And people will have choices like not at all, once or twice, all the way up to, a couple times a week, daily, multiple times a day. So that the coarseness of that measurement tool influences how good of an answer we can get. So a lot of the time, the evidence that a substance like cannabis, but not just cannabis, is having negative impacts relies really heavily on the people that are scoring at the farther end of a distribution like that, the people that are using cannabis every day, multiple times a day, at least once or twice a week. There are fewer of them, but they pull the relationship between substance use and an outcome kind of, they have an outsized influence, they tend to have an outsized influence. So when you're asking about, if there's harms or benefits, the harms tend to be focused on that subset of people who are regular, consistent cannabis users, that it's, part of their regular existence. It's not necessarily an occasional thing. The quality of the evidence that people who occasionally use cannabis are having ill effects is very poor. There's not a lot of reason to believe that having cannabis sometimes is going to have any long-term downstream negative effects.
Right. You mentioned doing surveys, and of course, as scientists, we think about causation and correlation. You hear cannabis causes anxiety, but anxious people probably take cannabis. So have there been studies that establish the causation?
Yeah, that one's really hard, because if you want to establish that something has a causal influence, you have to randomize people. You have to say, okay, we're going to bring in a bunch of people who are, say, cannabis naive, and randomly assign you to have some or not have some, and then see what happens. And even if you can do that kind of study, it's generally going to be pretty short term. And so, studies that will do that kind of randomization to substance will tend to observe things like self-control deficits and other sorts of impairments in the lab in the short term. But whether that means, down the road, you're going to fail to show up for work, you're going to, miss a class, you're going to, experience severe depression as a result of your use, that is incredibly difficult to do. So from my perspective, using cannabis as well as other substances, because cannabis users tend to not only use cannabis, the impacts are really difficult to pull apart from all the other reasons why you would use substances that go all the way to kind of, family environment in childhood, to, you know, what kind of anxiety you might be experiencing right now, what else is going on in your life, income, gender, whether your peers are using substances. There are so many factors that it's difficult to pull them apart, and I don't think there's compelling evidence that cannabis all by itself, once you pull apart the other reasons, is having, at small quantities at least, occasional quantities, is having meaningful impacts that are negative.
You know, you mentioned a controlled study, which is of course the gold standard, but have they done longitudinal studies with individuals where the cannabis use comes before in time the negative effects, and has that been fruitful?
Yeah, I mean, your best case scenario is that you're able to measure, in a longitudinal design, you're able to measure substance use before other influences have had an opportunity to act. So that works best if you're catching people when they're kids still. So you can kind of, you know, measure onset of any substance use, and you sort of have a relatively cohesive group of people that none of whom have had any experiences with substances. But again, those are still tied up with, you know, we might be able to demonstrate longitudinally that cannabis and other substances have negative effects, but they're still bound up with other factors that are happening for a person. You know, what's going on with them. You know, why did that person decide to start using cannabis when they were 15 and their peers didn't? Was you know, what was the decision making behind that? Were there other family factors involved? What was the nature of their peer group? Are they in an affluent or less affluent community? Lots of things.
Can I add to that? Because I think this is why animal research can sometimes add to the body of literature looking at causality, because while we can't randomize in humans, we can randomize in animals. And I would say there is data to support cannabis exposure does lead to increased anxiety, but the animal models have not been using cannabis as we know it, right? So they've been using pure THC or some you know, some agonist of the CB1 receptor. So it hasn't been a perfect replication of what we see in humans.
Why not? Like, why don't they just use cannabis?
So they've only just developed the cannabis vape model. Our colleague Ryan McLaughlin has developed that in Washington, actually a Canadian neuroscientist. Tons of great Canadian neuroscientists doing cannabis research. In 2018, I want to say. And so that's the first time, and they're actually just now being able to use the specific kinds of blends in the vape that humans are actually using. So the research is really in its infancy. But that said, there's lots of meta-analyses, large studies looking at lots of different papers that show actually very weak relationships between cannabis use and anxiety. It's stronger for depression. So you know, the research is still needs to happen, and as Andrew was saying, this is why animal research can't answer everything, and human research, we need to work together. We need to have lots of different perspectives to be able to answer some of these questions.
I'm probably not the only one in the room picturing a bunch of vaping rats.
I was too, actually.
I have the
was
videos.
Trying to picture
I have the videos.
That.
Students will see them in my classes. They're wild.
It's exactly as you would expect.
It is, yeah. They push on actually they nose poke. This thing comes out, and then they just kind of.
I was joking. I thought they like flooded the room with. Okay. So Canada, we have legal cannabis now, but you're not allowed to buy it. I don't know if you're allowed to take it, but you can't buy it until you're like 18 or 19 or something. One way to look at it is like, we're going to wait until they can drive, then we let them drink and use cannabis. But are there age effects on that we know of? Like, what is it important for kids not to use it? For teenagers?
Yeah,
Anybody can answer that.
This is more of a brain question, so I'll just say a little bit and then punt it to you two. The second most sensitive period in the life course for brain development, that's kind of the building new neurons and shedding old ones, and I'm probably saying it all wrong as not a neuroscientist, but adolescence is that second most critical period. And we count adolescents as starting from kind of age 10 to 12 all the way up to 25. So next to infancy. Infancy, then we kind of stay level through childhood, and then a big spike in how your brain is developing. So that period is quite sensitive, and it doesn't mean that using substances in adolescence is going to ruin you, because basically all adolescents use some substance at some point. It's very common, but it is a higher risk time period for more elaborate reasons that you two probably can.
You're a developmental psychologist. Own it.
Well, I think age of onset of use is one of the biggest factors when predicting potential harms for cannabis. Like, the younger people begin their cannabis use, the more, it doesn't mean that you're going to experience harms, but it does increase the risk of experiencing harms. The way I look at neurodevelopment is there's these what we call critical windows of activity. It's like not much is going on, and then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of activity that is required for shaping the brains, or sending neurons to their final location, or whatever the case is. And so I think, just like Dr. Howard was explaining, cannabis use during those kind of critical windows of neurodevelopment, we should be concerned about those. The specific age ranges are a little less clear. I was actually just talking about this with some of my students yesterday, but it's not as if you hear 25 thrown around a lot. It's not as if you wake up on your 25th birthday and your brain's like, all right, like, I'm done now, right? And so it's 25-ish. There's actually been more recent research that suggests maybe it's even later than 25, 26, 27, even 28 years old. And so look around the room, where there's a beautiful amount of diversity. Everyone is different. And so we can't then turn around and expect all of our brains to develop the exact same way and finish on the same date. So there is some concern around there, but yeah. So I wouldn't say like 25 is the cutoff date. It's probably less specific and more individual, more kind of individualistic. But certainly the age of onset of cannabis use is one of, if not the biggest predictor of experiencing harms later in life.
Yeah, and just a final point, that endocannabinoid system is important in brain development.
Yeah.
So if you're targeting it exogenously with cannabis products, it is being changed, and it is therefore also changing the way the brain fully develops. And because it's involved in stress and emotional regulation and all that stuff, what happens during adolescence? A lot of stress, a lot of inability to regulate our emotions, and we're altering that final stage of development into late adulthood, as Zach was just saying, which is the part of the brain that's involved in decision making. So the worry and concern, and again, it's very difficult to pin this down causally. The worry and concern is that you're using at a time when your brain is still developing, and you're going to permanently alter the course of brain development. That permanent piece is a bit vague and fuzzy, but we do know, as Zach was saying, the earlier you start using, the more likely that you will have problematic use later in life. That's the biggest predictor of cannabis use disorder and problematic cannabis use, is using cannabis before the age of 15.
But again, that age of onset isn't arbitrary. People don't just decide, I've had my 12th birthday, it feels like a good day for cannabis. There's a whole context behind that.
Right.
There are, children of all ages, like some of them are never going to have access to cannabis at age 12, and others have had it for years already. Most kids who start using super early get it from their parents and learn to use with their parents. But that is a very different developmental environment than one where you kind of happen to
Stumble across cannabis
at a party or whatever when you're a little older. So those are very different contextual situations that lead to why you would even have an age of onset that's quite young.
It sounds like when the brain is in a very plastic, changeable state, things like drugs of all kinds can have a larger effect because the brain is more flexible in some ways. And so good and bad things can have larger effects. I seem to remember something about habituation to drugs in general, that when your brain is flooded with a certain kind of thing, it will not naturally reduce the number of receptors. Is that true, and does that happen with cannabis too?
Yeah, so there's some suggestion that the brain wants to maintain a certain level of homeostasis. It wants to maintain a steady state, and it wants to sort of keep things status quo. So if you're consistently, again, I don't know what the proper verb is, but agonizing it is what we say, like, you know, pumping cannabis into that system. The endocannabinoid system is, and I'm anthropomorphizing here, it doesn't actually say that, but it's saying, oh boy, stop, too much. There's so much flooding the system, I'm gonna shut down my own native production of things like anandamide, those endocannabinoids. So this is why we see in chronic users this shifting baseline, where initially your mood is here and you use and you feel good, and after you use you feel a little rotten, and then over time you keep feeling more and more rotten when you're not using at all, because your body is stopping to produce all those natural feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters like the endocannabinoids, like dopamine, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the reasons why we think people develop chronic or compulsive behaviors, because they feel pretty awful when they're not using the substance. So yes, there is some suggestion the endocannabinoid system kind of shuts itself down.
Well, if somebody just wants a take home, like how much is safe? Zach, do you want to speak to, I know it depends on the person and everything, but like an average person, say, who doesn't use cannabis regularly, what would you just recommend, not knowing anything about them, what like a safe rate of consumption might be?
So I get asked this question a lot, believe it or not, from my students. Like, what is that one number that I can't go above?
They come to your office hours?
Yeah, they come to my office hours. I always turn to the Canada's cannabis low-risk use guidelines, and that was a really, really good resource. I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested. It was published by it was a collaborative effort, CCSA, the Centre on Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto. There was a bunch of others, CMHA, the Canadian Medical Association. And anyway, so they got together and they dug through all of the evidence and the available literature and came out with these low-risk cannabis use guidelines. And so, great resource. I always turn to that. And according to the low-risk guidelines, it's more related to frequency of use, and so they cite daily or near daily use as patterns of use that will increase your risk of experiencing harm. That harm doesn't necessarily have to be health related. There's a lot of social harms, you know, that you're increasing the risk of experiencing those as well. So, you know, I would say if you're you know, considering cannabis use, if you're wondering how much cannabis use is safe, I don't have a prescriptive number for you, unfortunately, but I would say to try to avoid daily or near daily use. Kind of like Andrea was saying earlier, there's not really strong evidence to show that occasional cannabis users, maybe you're, you know, using on the weekends or once in a while at a party, that type of use isn't very well tied to you know, to harms, both health-related and social harms. So age of onset, which we've already talked about, frequency of use, so you want to avoid using daily or near daily. And then I would say the last one is avoiding high THC products, which is kind of a shame right now. We're in a bit of a landscape where there's a huge push towards increasing the amount of THC in cannabis products. That's probably coming from the manufacturers, the dispensaries. There seems to be a bit of a desire from society to increase the potency of THC, and that scares me a little bit. So I would recommend avoiding some of these really, really high THC cannabis products, and those seem to be tied more to harms than the lower THC. And again, THC is not the only active component, but that does seem to be the one that has a bit of a target on it in terms of causing harms. So those would be my three recommendations: age of onset, frequency of use, and the potency of THC in cannabis products. Did I miss any obvious ones?
Well, I would say daily or near daily, sort of what Andrew was saying. It's not just about daily. It's like if you're using an edible, half an edible right before you go to bed. That's a bit different than if you're like the wake and bake, right? You're waking up, you're using. You can use consistently throughout the day. So, like we are seeing in our research as well, that it's that pattern of use, more so than the frequency of use, that really seems to make that difference.
And a complicating factor for cannabis compared to other legal substances like alcohol and nicotine is that dosing that you were talking about. You can get a whole wide variety of doses. You go into a cannabis shop or you talk to whoever you're buying from, there's a wide range, and we don't standardize that when we do surveys, right? We ask you if you've used it and how often you've used it. It's pretty unusual to have like large behavioral surveys that measure cannabis and a bunch of other stuff that have asked in really fine-grained detail about exactly how much, exactly in what concentration, how often those concentrations change for you, if you even know how concentrated your product is.
Yeah.
Well, we
Yeah.
tried, and students couldn't tell us.
They couldn't tell you.
They
I'm not
didn't
surprised.
know. We asked
Yeah.
them, like, what potency of THC are you using? Where are you,
You don't know.
where are you getting it from? Somebody gave it to
Yeah,
me.
somebody gave it to me.
Somebody gave
I have
it to
no
me.
idea.
I don't know what I'm using.
Yeah,
Which
that
is-
was much more common than I ever anticipated, but this is
Yeah.
definitely something Kim and I have been interested in for the last couple of years. We have one of our amazing grad students, Kira, here, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a little more granular. It's not just, do you use cannabis, yes or no? It's like, what reasons are you using cannabis, and what social settings are you using cannabis? What cannabis products are you using? And we thought like we were geniuses, like we're going to solve this problem. But as it turns out, not many people know those specific details. Oh, I shouldn't say not many, just there's a large proportion of people that just had no idea even how much money they spent on cannabis because they're not, so it was a little harder than we thought. But that's kind of what we're doing now. We're trying to paint a better picture of specific patterns of cannabis use that include reasons for using and trying to see which patterns of cannabis use are more associated with academic outcomes or mental health outcomes or so on and so forth.
Yeah, I read that in Ontario, the dispensary ticket rights were distributed completely randomly without any regard for cannabis knowledge or business knowledge.
So, I was
So
just
you
gonna-
don't know who, like the person you're talking to in the store needs no qualifications at all.
That's right. And I know we're focused on students here, but older adults are the fastest growing consumer of cannabis in Canada. And we are hearing a lot of information about older adults and seniors going into cannabis stores and asking information. And, oh, I heard that the CBD stuff is good. And being given certain formulations without being aware that your body's ability to metabolize these substances is very different, and if you're on certain medications, it's contraindicated, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about cannabis harms, I know we're focused on mental health, but it's also important to recognize that it is a drug. And so there needs to be a lot more work in policy on how we distribute information and who's working to be able to provide essentially information that relates to health.
Hopefully pharmacists would know.
Yes.
Like you could talk to a pharmacist and see if there are interactions with that. So I'm going to ask what might be a really stupid question. I've heard that cannabis intensity is much higher than it was like in the 70s. Is that because there's more THC or because the THC is more potent? Like is the amount of THC an accurate representative number of how much you're getting?
I think so. I know not all THC is created equally, but I think the percentage of THC is probably your best indicator of the potency of that product.
Not all THC is equal?
Not all
It's not a
THC is
molecule?
equal. Yeah, but there's, and this is going actually beyond my knowledge base, but the way the molecules interact with the receptors, if there's other
Compounds.
cannabinoids, Kim mentioned some phytocannabinoids in the plant, and so they might actually be binding
Oh,
to
I
different
see.
locations on that receptor, and it gets really, really complicated, and I don't fully understand that. But I do think that percentage of THC is probably your best indicator of potency.
Right. It's okay if you don't know this. I know we're focused on mental health, but are there any physical health bad effects that we should know about?
Yeah. There's something known as cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS. A lot of people don't realize that this exists, and Zach and I actually did an awesome collaboration. We run a campaign called CU Cannabis Crew. It's a social media campaign. You can find us on Instagram. And we also post on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And we did an awesome collaboration with a scholar out at Western who her whole research is on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome because she uses a model organism, the vole, which is the only rodent that vomits. Who knew? Rats don't vomit, but voles do. So we know that cannabis products, typically they are anti-emetic. We use them in situations in cancer, right? So when chemotherapy produces nausea and vomiting, and cannabis products have been useful in that regard. So it might seem odd to find out that, lo and behold, if you use cannabis products consistently, regularly, high THC products, In a subset of the population, they develop something known as cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which is essentially the opposite. People start vomiting and they can't stop. And the only treatment for that, surprise, stop using cannabis. Tell that to somebody who's using daily or near daily use, right? And so a lot of people don't realize that this is actually a thing. Emergency docs I'm hearing are now being trained to ask for this and look for this in the ER, because unlike other conditions that cause vomiting, you can treat it very well with antiemetics like ondansetron, but it doesn't work in cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. So typical antiemetics will not control this nausea and vomiting. And so it's pretty brutal, and it's very hard to manage that, particularly among a population of folks who are using regularly, and we always want to try to approach that with compassion, right? I work very closely with folks in the addictions realm, and it's always really important that we have a compassionate conversation about use, and that's really difficult. So that I would say was one of the physical harms associated with chronic cannabis use.
Cannabis has a reputation for making you lazy and sapping your motivation. Is there any scientific evidence of that, Ken?
Amotivational syndrome, it was very hot in the 70s, right? People were like, oh, cannabis kills your motivation. We had this, lots of work in that field around the 70s to the 90s, and then it kind of petered off. As we've talked about the challenges with working with human populations, you can't look at amotivational syndrome in rats. Well, you can. I guess you can. Maybe. It's a bit harder. You can't see if they're going to school or not. But working with human populations is difficult. It's difficult to say causality, right? There's lots of things that could be happening in a social context with that individual to lead to a loss of motivation. It could be that amotivated people are more likely to use cannabis products. But I did find, I was looking at the literature recently, and there was one paper where they did look at this longitudinally. They looked at people across time. They controlled for all other substance use, alcohol, nicotine, everything else. And they did find that there was a small decrease in folks that were using cannabis chronically in, I can't remember the actual concept that they termed, but it was basically motivated behaviors. So there is something there. I would say what cannabis does, as well as I sort of alluding to, it changes your endocannabinoid system, but also changes your reward circuit and dopamine, which is one of the main signals in your reward circuit, and it is involved in motivated behavior. When we think about depression, a lot of depression is marked by amotivational syndrome. You don't want to get out of bed, you don't want to socialize, you feel kind of awful, and cannabis will burn out that dopamine system, and that could relate to those motivated behaviors, and it does so in a particularly potent way, I would say, which is also interesting because that might explain cannabis's relationship with schizophrenia, which I don't know if we want to touch on, because cannabis can induce schizophrenic like conditions, and schizophrenia is marked by alterations in the dopamine circuit. So it's got something interesting with regard to dopamine.
Regarding animal models, isn't there some swimming test that measures motivation? Like the longer they swim?
That's depression.
Isn't it also, but it's maybe used to measure depression, but it is a motivational,
Yeah, there's people who argue, if the rat stops swimming, it's giving up, right? So is it actually measuring depression or just?
Okay.
Yeah, so
we can't ask them.
You can't ask them.
Or you can ask them. You don't
Sure.
get a response. Well, let's talk about some maybe some good things about cannabis. How about Andrea? Do you know of any positive beneficial effects of cannabis that have been found by science?
So I want to talk about two pieces of this. One is substances are very social, and so benefits of occasional use of substances tend to be socially related, right? Like I'm having a better time with my friends, I'm feeling included. So those feel artificial, but they are real benefits. Not strictly for cannabis, but among other substances. What I wanted to talk about that we discussed before was that a lot of young people with ADHD feel very strongly that using cannabis helps them with their ADHD symptoms. And The evidence in favor of that is very poor. It's entirely, I'm going to phrase that differently. All of the evidence that cannabis is having beneficial effects for young people with ADHD comes from qualitative perceptions. So there's strong perceptions, there's message boards everywhere filled with young people and their families talking about cannabis improving their ADHD symptoms. So that's things like improving their ability to, ironically, improving their ability to focus to some extent, but also kind of just calming down some of the more intense behavioral feelings that make it difficult to sort of focus on task. So if you ask people who are experiencing ADHD symptoms and are using cannabis, they will tell you it helps me. Studies that try to test whether that's true have not tended to find that there's any particular benefit, but also not any particular harms either over and above what we already discussed about highly frequent cannabis use. So there's something to be said for, if there's a placebo effect tied to cannabis, if you believe it's working well for you and it's not harming you, then that is one way to think of it as beneficial.
Okay. Is cannabis addictive, Zach?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. One of the first questions you asked me was about kind of young adult perceptions of cannabis, and that was actually one of the themes I forgot to mention. There was this overarching theme that cannabis wasn't addictive, which I also was a little bit concerning because we know that it is. The numbers haven't really changed. If you look at the last, 30, 40, 50 years of research, the number of people who are dependent on cannabis seems to hover around 10%. Maybe we saw a little blip or a little increase after legalization. All of our studies come in at kind of in and around that 10% mark. So we think about 10% of individuals who consume cannabis will develop an addiction. It is a diagnosable condition. It's called the cannabis use disorder. It's kind of under the larger umbrella of substance use disorders, which doctors will use the DSM-5 to make these kinds of diagnoses, and so we do see cannabis use disorder in the DSM-5. It's got all the hallmarks of addiction. It works on the same networks or circuits in the brain that are sort of viewed as the common denominator for most addictive substances, and Kim's mentioned the reward system several times. You have withdrawal symptoms if you're using chronically and consistently and then decide to abstain. You will show withdrawal symptoms. You'll show cravings for cannabis consumption. So it's got all of the hallmarks of an addictive substance. And like looking back at the last half a century of research, about 10% of people who use cannabis will go on to develop a cannabis use disorder. So yes, it is.
You used the word dependence. Is dependence and addiction the same thing?
They're not. They're closely related. Dependence would be like if you don't use the substance, you will start displaying withdrawal symptoms. That's a really good indicator that your body is physically dependent on that substance. Kim mentioned homeostasis a couple of times, and it's like your body's always trying to maintain you at this homeostasis. And so if you start putting substances that tip the scale, your body starts to make changes to compensate to get you back to homeostasis. And then of course, if you take the substance out, the scale usually tips in the other direction because of those changes. And those changes are more of a marker of a physical dependence. Addiction has other aspects to it, like does it interfere with your social relationships? Is it interfering with your ability to show up to work and get your responsibilities done? Or if you're a student, like is it interfering with your ability to show up to class on time, so on and so forth. So addiction is I think like a more broad term that encompasses the physical dependence part, but also more of the social aspects as well. And
So
I tend to use them interchangeably.
okay, it's all right. We'll let it pass. You said like 10% of users are addicted. Is I guess percentage of users who are addicted might be a rough measure of how addictive a substance is. Just to give everybody a little context, do we know what percentage of alcohol users are addicted, just to give us a sense of how addictive cannabis is?
I should know these numbers off by heart, and I don't. The number of people who drink alcohol and develop an addiction to alcohol is higher than
Okay.
the 10% for cannabis. So cannabis is considered to be less addictive than cocaine, opioids, alcohol.
Okay.
And there was a study that pitted all of these drugs against each other, and I'm forgetting the details because I have a whole room full of people.
Kim has
staring
something
at
to
me,
say.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning that because addiction is so stigmatized, there's very few people who actually have a formal diagnosis of a use disorder. But if you look at statistics of who's using alcohol in Canada, it's more like 87 to 89% of Canadians are using alcohol, and of that, most of them are using weekly, right? Many of them are, I shouldn't say most, close to 50% are using weekly. And when we can look at the sort of like more use, more harms, like we can extrapolate that there are quite a number of people that are using alcohol, I would say problematically, but would not consider themselves to have an alcohol use disorder. So that's why folks in the substance using community argue for using a substance use health lens approach. Instead of just focusing on who has the addiction, who is using, and where might you situate yourself. This is also associated with harms as well. So I would say, extrapolating from that, yeah, there are more folks in Canada that I would say are using alcohol problematically than are using cannabis problematically, and alcohol is known to be more addictive than cannabis. You have to use a lot of cannabis to develop a use disorder, PS. Like high dose THC, tolerance is much, it's much harder to achieve tolerance to cannabis than it is to achieve tolerance to alcohol.
So the legality or illegality of a substance is not really all that correlated to how addictive it is, right?
Yes.
Nicotine
Yes.
is extremely legal and extremely addictive.
Yeah.
But we have also plenty of illegal drugs or misused prescription substances that are less addictive than some of our legal substances. And so, I mean, we have a lot of stigmatizing ideas about somebody who uses an illegal drug is some kind of addict, junkie, whatever kind of term and like image you're putting on that person, when there really, in fact, are a lot of people who are very safely and comfortably occasionally using substances that they've had to obtain illegally. And they're no more impaired than anybody else who's an occasional alcohol user. So that's a bigger part of the picture that's important to think about, right? The legal doesn't mean safer.
Yeah.
Right. Andrea, is there a causal relationship found between cannabis use and grades in university?
To some extent, and for frequent, consistent use. So that's kind of coming back to the cognitive impairments attached to regular cannabis use. So that, occasional cannabis use isn't going to cause you to fail your course, but a long-term pattern of using cannabis and the cognitive problems that will come with it. There is some evidence that there are academic impairments attached to that, but there's also studies that kind of factor in all of those contextual issues we've been talking about as well that matter. And those to some extent wipe away effects related to grades. Like, why did you decide to use cannabis on a daily basis while you were at university? That's not an arbitrary decision that got made. So part of why the grades end up lower in that heavily using student is tied to other things going on for them compared to a student who's never using or using occasionally at parties.
I was reading that alcohol helps you get to sleep, but deteriorates your quality of sleep. Is there anything like that with cannabis found? Effects of sleep, on sleep?
Cannabis will help you sleep. Yep. But most substances alter your quality and quantity of your REM sleep. So there's different sleep states and different sleep waves cycles that we go through. We have REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And we also have deep sleep, and pretty much a lot of substances affect the brain, will impact your REM sleep, including things like antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, I should say. I would say alcohol is probably worse at impairing sleep than cannabis. Cannabis is actually, often people use it as a sleep aid, and they do report that it helps with how much they sleep for people particularly who have insomnia. But it's worth noting that it does affect the different rhythms of your brain during that sleep.
But as far as we know, it doesn't reduce the amount of deep sleep?
It reduces the amount of REM sleep.
REM sleep.
Cannabis does.
And replaces it with what?
You just cycle through, like there's stages 1 through 4. 1 is very light, you're kind of tossing and turning. You know, if someone said your name, you'd probably wake up because you're not fully asleep, and then you sort of go down into deeper cycles, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 sleep. You typically would then go into REM. As Kim said, REM is rapid eye movement, so you probably recognize this as like when you dream. By the way, fun fact, you actually dream in the other stages of your sleep, but the dreams in REM tend to be more vivid, and so those are the ones that you are more likely to remember. And then you would go from REM sleep back up this cycle, stage 4, stage 3, stage 2, stage 1. And so what cannabis does is it doesn't prevent you from entering REM, but it shortens the amount of time that you stay in REM sleep. And so if you look at like an 8-hour sleep cycle with or without cannabis, the with cannabis group would have lower amount of time spent in REM sleep, which is really interesting. We don't really know what's going on in REM sleep. We don't really know why our bodies kind of require REM sleep, but we do know that cannabis decreases the amount of REM you get, and if you abstain from cannabis, like if you were a regular cannabis user and then you decided to quit, you might notice that you have very intense and vivid dreams, and that's probably showing like a rebound effect of your body actually kind of making up some of that lost time. There seems to be some quota that human beings need to get in terms of the number of hours spent in REM sleep. And so, I think I just said this, but if you're using cannabis chronically and then quit, it's like your body shoots into this rebound mode where it's trying to catch up on that REM sleep. And if you talk to individuals who have experienced this, they'll say, I had wild dreams, or I had more dreams last night. So their dreams actually get more vivid, and that's something that the individual will be aware of.
What are some of the predictors of addiction to cannabis? So if someone might consider using cannabis or using it more, are there some populations that are more vulnerable to addiction?
So my background is in neurobiology of addiction and specifically looking at vulnerability to addiction. And one of the biggest predictors of later life addictions, regardless of the substance, is experiences of early life trauma. So childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, and so on. In the research that Zach and I have been doing, along with other amazing collaborators at Carleton, we were looking at, particularly in young adults, what are the patterns, methods, motivations for use that are particularly associated with problematic cannabis use, because we can't diagnose. We're not diagnosing it, we're just looking at indicators of problematic use. And what we do find, interestingly, is at least among a young adult population, using cannabis recreationally, so to get high, to party, is not associated with problematic cannabis use. Instead, it seems to be mostly related to your motivations for use. And specifically, students who tell us that they're using to cope with poor mood, to cope with stress, for anxiety. Boredom also comes out as a big predictor, oddly. Those seem to be related more to problematic cannabis use. And my amazing grad student, Kira, who's here, her master's thesis is actually going to explore this a little bit more fulsomely, because we're going to start to look at biomarkers associated with problematic cannabis use. So Kira's really interested in seeing if people who've had that experience of early life trauma, we know one of the things that early life trauma does is it alters the wiring of that endocannabinoid system. So the hypothesis is you've got that changed endocannabinoid system. Are people using cannabis then to sort of self-medicate that change in that ability to manage their stress and your emotional states? So we're also going to be, we're going to ask students, are you using cannabis, how much, etc. We're also going to take their blood and saliva with their permission, of course. And look at markers of the endocannabinoid function in the blood, and in the saliva we're going to look at stress markers. So we're trying to see if there's a unique biomarker profile that's associated with problematic cannabis use to sort of build on our knowledge of what does predict vulnerability to cannabis use disorder. And young adults and students, they're a high-risk population because they're using cannabis the most. They're also faced with unique stressors, and as we've mentioned, they're at a unique developmental age.
Just a point of order. I see some mics set up. Did we want to have questions from the audience? Oh, okay. I'll make sure we. All right, we'll do one last bit, and then we'll have some questions. There are mics there, and what we're going to do after they answer, not before, you can line up behind there and ask questions. So you can start formulating your questions now. You can. But I wanted to just ask. I think all of you are currently involved with research. I wanted to ask about about your opinions of the future of cannabis research, or maybe some exciting projects you have coming up. And we can just start with Andrea and move toward me.
From my end, I think there's a lot going on studying simultaneous alcohol and cannabis use. That seems to be a particularly potent combination, not necessarily because the substances interact, although they do, but because behaviorally choices to co-use substances, meaning literally at the same time overlapping effects, reflect other things going on with students. So polysubstance use, multiple substance use is a really important direction. So I don't know, I don't have a cannabis study ready to go that I want to tell you about, so I'm going to let Kim and Zach.
Not yet,
great.
because we gotta work on some. So I am really interested in understanding more about cannabis use disorder, and I'm really interested in that changing market with increasing THC content cannabis products that are out there, because all the research that we know of about the relationships between cannabis and mental health, it's built on the body of literature from cannabis that is not on the market today. So I'm really intrigued to see where this is going to develop. Canada is on the world stage in terms of cannabis research. Other countries are looking to us to see what is the impact of legalization on harms associated with cannabis use. We haven't really seen any changes in how much people are using post-legalization. Believe it or not, there's been blips. I mean, COVID did something, but what has changed is the proportion of people using problematically. So we are seeing an increase in people using daily or near daily, so we need to kind of keep an eye on that and see how much we can understand who's at risk and then message that out. And on that, I'm going to turn it to Zach, because I know he's got some comments there.
I think for me, I think the future of research in this area should focus on unpacking the cannabis plant a little bit. It is a very complicated beast. We're, up here, and all of our research is focused on THC and CBD, and probably to a lesser extent CBN. These are some of the active components in the cannabis plant, but there's probably 40 or 50 that we don't know about yet. You're actually, and I'm learning these new ones from my students. They're the ones telling me, I was in the dispensary and I saw, CBG, and they're calling it the caffeine of the cannabis plant. And it's well, what does that mean? And so I think we need to do a lot of work trying to unpack that cannabis plant and better understand all of the psychoactive components and how they work together, because they're not in isolation. You don't just take THC, you're taking THC with a whole bunch of other active components, and we currently do not understand what those other phytocannabinoids are doing. I think you're right. I think it's really important also to look at cannabis and alcohol use. So I'm excited to see how that play out. In fact, I learned a new term, a new word last year. I think students will correct me if I'm wrong. They say cross-faded, and this is when they're, I didn't know that was a thing.
There's
right?
laughter, people notice. What is that?
And so it is when people are making this conscious decision to use cannabis and alcohol together, and so this is called cross-faded, I think, right? And so, so I think it's
the way that you balance the effects of timing, your cannabis and your alcohol use, so that you experience the highs at the right time. I guess everybody's going to have a personal definition of how that's going to work for them. But
so I'm very interested in that too.
Thank you so much. Let's, people can start lining up for questions. Let's give a hand to our panelists. So we have a mic there near Taryn standing up, and there's a microphone over there. Taryn, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I was wondering, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I was wondering if you'd be able to expand on the relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia, and also why cannabis appears to make some people more paranoid rather than calming them down. Is this an innate difference, or is it also related to those factors like early childhood trauma?
Great question. So I'll answer the first one first. So what we do know is that for some people who carry a very specific copy of a gene, and of course, unless we're doing one 23andMe or whatever that is, we don't know what our genetic composition is, that have a specific copy of a gene and use high THC content products before the age of 15, 16, fairly regularly, and typically almost always male, that combination tends to favor the onset of schizophrenic-like disorders later in late adolescence. Now, schizophrenia is a complex mental health condition that has possibly many different neurodevelopmental origins. There's lots of different ways to potentially get schizophrenia, but it doesn't typically appear until late adolescence, early adulthood, when wiring of key brain regions evolved again in regulating emotional activity, cognitions, and thoughts. That doesn't tend to happen until that period of time. So we don't really see the onset of those things until then. And then, so somebody's been using, and sometimes they use, and they might be experiencing minor changes with schizophrenia, so like distorted thoughts, and then it goes into full-blown paranoid state. And so one thing that Canada did see post-legalization is an increase in hospital admissions due to paranoid states among youth. CHEO was apparently quite high for that. So again, it's because of this specific copy of the gene that regulates the clearance of dopamine from key brain regions. So there's dopamine is involved in schizophrenia. You have too much in some areas of the brain, too little in others. And again, cannabis targets those brain areas to some extent. So to answer your second question, this is something I've been wanting to know. One of the studies that I first designed looking at cannabis pre-legalization was trying to understand exactly that, was why do some people develop more paranoid states when they're using, and others it actually is an anxiety relief. We don't fully know. It probably has something to do with dose, and it has some individual differences in your biochemistry. Again, we don't really fully know what that is, but I would say most people, if they use cannabis and it's high THC content and they get high very quickly, they will feel a little anxious. It increases your heart rate up about 14 beats per minute on average, so your heart rate is going to be increasing, and depending on your context, and depending what's happening, if you're in a highly anxious space, you could actually develop more paranoia. If you're in a low anxious space, less. So it's unique biochemistry. We don't fully understand that, but certainly there are people who I think over time use it for anxiety relief. So it's complex.
Great, thank you.
Like the brain.
Okay, let's take a person over here.
Yeah, I actually have two questions.
You were going to ask one, and then you get back in line, if that's all right.
Okay, I can do that. I was just wondering, so you guys talked a lot about homeostasis and how like prolonged cannabis use can like tip you down, and then you also mentioned that condition where you vomit. I don't remember what it's
Cannabis
called.
hyperemesis syndrome.
Okay, yes, that. And then, like I'm assuming also too, the longer you use it, like the worse your anxiety would get without it. So does your body regulate if you stop using? Like even if you've been using for a long time?
Oh, do you mean like if your scale was tipped and you abstain? Yeah, eventually your body will make the opposite of the changes it made to kind of decrease the effects of the drug. And so yeah, you can get back to your kind of normal baseline. We don't know how long that time period is. Like how long do you have to abstain before your brain has kind of changed it back to how it was before you started using cannabis? That probably has a lot to do with frequency of use and length of time. In other words, if you've been using cannabis for 20 years daily and then you abstain, you can't expect your brain to undo all those changes in a week, right? It's probably going to take several years for that to happen, but the specific timeline is unknown, or at least I don't know the specific timeline.
And I do encourage you to get back in line. We would love to hear your other questions. Can we get a question from over here?
Thank you. So my question is actually very much related to the previous participant's question. I assume that by now we know a lot about, alcohol addiction, gambling addiction, and fighting it. What do you do with it? Can you tell us something about best strategies for fighting cannabis addiction for, let's say, audience like our students? Let's say, assume the examples that you mentioned, someone started in high school, 4 or 5 years, pretty heavy use. At some point they listen to their profs and they realize, maybe that's not the best idea. So what do we know about best approaches so far, most successful approaches for getting off it, and does it necessarily include maybe some psychological or psychiatric examination to find out, are there some underlying issues? So overall, what would be the best approach for a student in this situation who wants to get off cannabis? Where do they begin? Thank you.
So your question's really interesting because it brings up a core problem in kind of diagnosis and treatment, which is that dealing with multiple problems at once is something that mental health professionals are not well equipped to do, the systems that they're working in. So for example, at our health services on campus, if you come in for support with your depression or anxiety and you're currently using cannabis, they will tell you to get off cannabis and then come back and talk about your depression and anxiety. And similarly, on the other side, if you're seeking help for a substance use disorder, that professional might want you to get your anxiety and depression taken care of first. So it's very difficult to get proper care for kind of multiple problems at once. I mean, the best strategies are kind of detecting problems early before they've gotten out of control. Nobody has a cannabis use disorder the first day they try cannabis. So, there's always an opportunity for early detection. Reducing stigma associated with seeking help and reporting your problems, and more integrated care that allows for, people to kind of be treated for the multiple things that are going on with them. So it's more of a systemic change that needs to happen. I mean, counseling services at Carleton has been kind of building and becoming equipped to address things better, but it's still, there's a big system challenge in people getting the help they need. So from my perspective, your best defense is a good offense. Is that the expression? Yeah,
and that's partly why the impetus behind our student-led campaigns, at CU Cannabis Crew, and our Amazing Stigma Ends at CU campaign, which is really about developing knowledge and providing the students with the information around those pink flags instead of the red flags. And I would say peer support is huge, and Carleton does have the benefit of partnership with CAPSA. So we do have all pathways on campus, which is a peer-led group specifically around that, so that anybody who has any issues with substances can come, and it's an amazing space to have conversation with other folks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Over here.
So you guys touched briefly on abstaining or quitting usage, but what about tolerance breaks? Do you know if there's anything productive about having a tolerance break if you're someone who frequently uses?
What is a tolerance break?
Tolerance break, yeah, it's a great harm reduction strategy and approach to reduce harms associated with use. So tolerance breaks are folks that use cannabis regularly, and then they take a break for a week or two, and then they go back to use, and it has been demonstrated to be beneficial for reducing some of the harms associated with cannabis use. Yeah, tolerance breaks are great.
And it does so, I'll just add, if I could quickly, it does so by reducing the frequency and the dose, right? If you've gotten rid of your tolerance, or if you've decreased your tolerance, then the next time you consume cannabis, your dose is probably going to be lower, and you might not consume at the same frequency because you're feeling the effect. So, and this goes back to kind of those low-risk cannabis consumption guidelines that really preach not daily or near daily, and lower the doses. So I think this idea of, what was the term that tolerance break. I think that is a really good way to keep your frequency and dose kind of in that lower range. Great question.
Hello. I wanted to ask a question related to the first question that was asked about schizophrenia and cannabis. So I understand that there is a relationship between psychosis and cannabis use, but I was wondering if, given that it's hard to establish causality in human studies, is it 100% confirmed the direction of the relationship? Is it possible that people are self-medicating psychosis with cannabis, or vice versa?
It's a great question, and it's not 100%.
Nothing's ever 100%.
Nothing is ever 100%. Folks that have the copy of the gene were they more at risk for the development of schizophrenia, period? Maybe, right? But the reality is cannabis use is going to hasten the onset and probably make the symptoms worse. So what I forgot to say is that dopamine is at the root of paranoia, right? So any drug that you take that boosts dopamine really high, amphetamines, cocaine is another one, it's going to produce a paranoid state. And so that's what I was sort of alluding to earlier with cannabis being a very proximal mediator of dopamine. It really targets that system. So it's an epigenetic interaction for sure. And we'll never fully be able to answer that, I don't think. Maybe with advanced gene molecular biological techniques, I'm not sure. But certainly we know that that association is very strong, and it's been one of the more causally associated relationships than anything else related to cannabis use and other mental health disorders. Cannabis and schizophrenia are very much linked.
Yeah, I would agree. We're never going to be 100%, but I think we're pretty certain that MET-Val allele at the COMT gene, I'm saying these words because I know you know what this means. I think that has really been shown to have a causal relationship. And again, if you have this genetic mutation, it doesn't mean if you consume cannabis you will develop schizophrenia, but it's saying that you will have a significant increase in the risk. So there's always that environmental component that's a bit of a wild card. But like Kim said, like that's one of the most understood relationships between cannabis and schizophrenia is that specific MET-Val allele at the COMT gene.
Okay, good, thank you.
So you have mentioned how substance like cannabis use will kind of tip your homeostasis by those endocannabinoid.
You got it, endocannabinoid. Yeah, it's a lot of syllables.
I'm going to make a comparison here because another thing kind of fascinates me is how people, when they listen to music, they feel certain pleasures and joys. For example, I have that kind of feeling, and I haven't ever used substance like that, and I kind of wonder how they're similar because now after listening to so many music, I sometimes have the tensions trying to maybe play some notes on maybe the piano there. So this kind of, I think it's kind of similar to addiction, though I don't think it's probably classified as addiction. The dominant factors of this kind of behavior, is that similar to how endocannabinoid functions in our brain and things like that?
So you're just wondering, the endocannabinoid system, what's its role in doing this? That homeostatic?
Like in terms of other like stimulus, like music.
I think
he's thinking about like other situations that produce similar effects.
Right.
Can you get high on music? I think is.
Yeah. So great question. So I teach neurobasis of addiction. Several of my former students here in this room, and what I would say is there's lots of things that produce pleasure, right? Dancing, singing, playing hockey, sexual activity, eating. They all activate that reward circuit. That's the one main target, among other things. But the way in which they activate that system is at a much lower level than any of the exogenous substances, so that things like cocaine and cannabis and alcohol and so on. It really potently activates mesolimbic dopamine and also activates endorphins and endocannabinoids. And it does so at a rate that's way higher than those natural rewarding events. Like my target party line is, whereas eating might activate 10 units of dopamine, cocaine will activate 10,000 units. How can you compete, right? So when we think about folks that are addicted to things like cocaine, we gotta say, well, you know, do you blame them, right? What's happening is their nervous system is being so activated to believe that cocaine is what's necessary to survive. Because fundamentally that reward circuit is there because it's activated when we experience events that are critical for our survival. So food and sex, right? And in society, we have lots of other things that lead to that, but ultimately we're here because our ancestors felt good when they ate food, right? And so it's linked to our survival. So when we take substances that capitalize on that system, it's tricking the brain into thinking this is what's important for survival, nothing else.
So the rewarding circuit is the crucial component that kind of naturally associate those activities together.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. Go ahead.
Hello, sorry, I'm a bit short for the mic. But I know there's studies looking into cannabis poly-use with alcohol and even the transition into harder drugs. You know, there's a theory that it's a gateway drug. What kind of research is being done to look at more everyday use? I'm thinking more in the lines of like cigarettes, and then the drug that we really call a drug a lot, caffeine.
What was the question, sorry?
I'm talking too much.
Are we doing a lot of research, or what kind of research is being done looking at poly-use between
Poly-use and other substances.
Yeah.
tobacco
Right.
and drugs like caffeine?
Gotcha.
So that's like, I don't think there's a lot of studies that just sort of ask an open-ended question like what's going on with polysubstance use. It's tricky because lots of different people will use lots of different combinations. There's definitely studies on negative effects of caffeine and positive effects of caffeine. I think polysubstance use though is pretty understudied, and like I was mentioning before, kind of the newest wave of studies with cannabis are tying them to alcohol use at the same time and seeing what risks are attached to that simultaneous use compared to just alcohol alone or cannabis alone. Similar ideas tied to other kinds of polysubstance use. And it's like the theoretical work behind that is really just what is bringing people to those use choices. Is it, like kind of more of an impulsive decision-making pathway? Is it deliberate and reasoned? What else is going on in their lives? Polysubstance use would generally be the most risky. Caffeine combined with alcohol is generally quite problematic. There were some products that had to get taken off the market for that reason. There's, co-using any substances generally suggests a higher risk profile for a lot of outcomes.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we are out of time.
Let's take
However,
one more.
you want to take one more?
Yeah, we'll take one more.
Kim's much more generous than I am with keeping time. I'm just saying we're going to take one more question, but then we have the other room. You're welcome to go in there. We'll all be circulating if you want to ask questions one-on-one, but we'll take one last question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to make this quick. So I work with a lot of youth who've grown up in quite aversive backgrounds, and they've ended up using a lot of cannabis at a very young age, as well as a myriad of other drugs. Is there a way that we can reverse those sort of, I guess, harmful impacts that cannabis has during those critical developmental years?
It's a golden question.
Yeah.
I mean, there's very little that's irreversible about substance use, right? There's, I mean, if you've had kind of a brain-altering effect that cannot be reversed, that does happen from time to time, I guess. But for the most part, the brain is a very plastic organism that will recover. So there's never a bad time to decide to like stop being a heavy, frequent user of any substance and kind of pare that back down to a more reasonable, manageable amount that reduces harm. So, so I don't want to say like that there's kind of one best time or that there's a point of no return. It's pretty much always the case that you could make improvements. Your body will kind of return to that homeostasis after enough time. You will kind of cognitive impairments that you experience may or may not be persistent for the rest of your life. I'm not sure that the evidence is strong that a cognitive impairment you've developed from a lot of cannabis use is going to last forever. I think generally we tend to go with, like, there's probably a lot to be gained. So.
And I think, like I said, I work a lot with the substance using community, and it's important to recognize there's a lot of people living well with a substance use disorder that are living well, they're in recovery, they're abstinent, whatever well looks like for them. And often we hear from folks that are experiencing struggle associated with substance use. They want to know, when do I go back to before I was using, right? So when do I go back here? And what I would always say is, we go here. Why would you want to go back to this, which was a brain that was at risk, right, for various reasons, you know? And so it's really important to look forward to living well, living in recovery, and we see beautiful brain imaging research that shows that this is entirely possible, that we see brain activity that has resumed to what would be considered an abstinent brain. So I would say let's leave with those messages of hope.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thanks to the panelists and for the organizers. And please join us here, go through that hallway and into the other room. There might be some snacks and coffee left. We'll look forward to talking to you in there. Good night.